Just the pledge is enough at this point, so thank you.
Thank you. Any further public comment? Seeing none, we come back to the council for debate. Is there any council comment on RC6? Councilmember Flaherty.
Yeah, a few comments. First, I want to thank Mr. Akers for bringing this up at our last Land Use Committee meeting. It's not something that's been discussed at all. Ideally, we would have all discussed it earlier, and we would have been corresponding with the petitioner earlier to help work through this process. Hopefully, it can be a learning experience for everybody on council, as well as petitioner and staff, to look at these types of proposals with planned unit developments in particular going forward. I'll mention, I want to express my appreciation as well to Mr. Curry for diligently working to look at this over the last day or two. Ultimately, yes, 15 kilowatts is not a particularly large capacity. It's about 3 homes. That came from it was a commitment to look at it and to commit to a minimum number that would charge at least some of the electric vehicle charging stations. That's where the number came from and the idea for it came from. But I'll second Councilmember Vogelin's point that this, especially under net metering with tax credits, and if installation occurs during construction, the soft costs are much, much lower. And this really is cost effective in the near term, payback periods of inside of 10 years, after which you get free electricity for a long time. So I would just strongly encourage the petitioner to look at installing more, which of course is why reasonable condition 4 anticipates that possibility and will allow you to do more consistent with that condition. So I think it's something that is a great element to include as we weigh the benefits that a planned unit development brings to the community under our criteria for consideration. So thank you.
Other comments on it? Councilmember Sims.
Thank you. I support this reasonable condition. And the language is there in black and white on what we intended it for it to do. And I'm glad to hear public comment that this is acceptable to them. But in many of the things that we've discussed in the past, sometimes when we have this type of legislation, we get perilously close of changing the design and doing other micromanagement stuff by saying, can you do 50% more than what we just asked you to do, what you agreed to do? So I'm okay with that. I just think we need to be careful. And if we want more, we need to ask for more in the reasonable conditions in the first place. And that's not a knock on anyone. I just think we've talked about timing and saving times and discussions and changing things in this meeting and that meeting and this meeting. So once we've got it here, if it's acceptable, and if he's agreeable to trying to increase it in the future, I think that's good enough, as one of our public commenters said, and I want to thank Councilmember Flaherty for bringing this forward.
Thank you. Any further comment? I'll take a bite of the apple if no one else will. I was just going to say, I wish that what Councilor Flaherty said were true, that he'll have free energy for a long time to come. But unfortunately, the state is winding down. I mean, I got my solar installed just at the end of 2017 when there was still 30 years of net metering according to state law. Anyone who installed after that is only getting 15. And if Mr. Curry or whoever else, anyone who wants to install solar doesn't do it by the end of 2022, then they lose right now there's 15 years on the table. And it takes about 8 to 10 years to pay off the investment. So he'll have free energy for 5 years, and then Duke will start paying 30 cents on the dollar wholesale rates for energy instead of the net value of it, which is disappointing. And I'm hopeful that by 2037, the state will have come to its senses and let people keep the money that their power is worth. Having said that, this is a good thing, and as much as they want to install, I'm happy about. Any Councilmember Flaherty?
Point of correction, I think actually, the net metering applies when you produce more energy than you are able to consume at any given time. So if you have a home system that produces enough to cover your whole annual use, inevitably in the summer you're producing more, and that's when you get a poor deal in a system that is not net metered. But in this case, it is highly unlikely that you all would ever produce more energy from solar than you are using on the site at any given time. So actually I think it's irrelevant in a situation like this, just not to mislead the public.
Thanks. That you're right. With that, I had admitted it, Councilmember Sims. Yes, that's right. Do I hear a motion? We have a call in the second. Will the clerk please call the roll on reasonable condition number 6?
Councilmember Sandberg,
Yes.
Rallo,
Yes.
Scambalori,
Yes.
Rosenbarger,
Yes.
Sims,
Yes.
Volin,
Yes.
Piedmont Smith,
Yes.
Flaherty,
Yes?
Smith,
Yes.
That passes 9-0.
Mr. President, I move reasonable condition 7 to ordinance 2001.
We have a motion and a second. You have 3 minutes to present.
There were a lot of concerns from the neighbors about the traffic that would be generated by this project and the number of people living there and using the commercial space. There was not a traffic study done up to this point for this intersection. The opinion of the city engineers was that probably it wouldn't warrant a traffic signal at this location. The Plan Commission did put as a reasonable condition, or as a condition of approval, that a traffic study shall be done before the final plan is approved. And so this reasonable condition seeks to do something with that information. If the traffic study reveals that a signalized intersection is necessary, then it seems reasonable to require the developer to pay for that signalization. So that is what this reasonable condition proposes. Again, the prediction by our engineers is that it will not be needed, but we are not sure because we have not done a recent traffic study. So this would require the petitioner to enter a written commitment and to pay for a signal if it is warranted.
Thank you. Staff, what say you?
From us.
Petitioner, what say you?
How much time do I have?
Got a minute 30 to just make your initial.
So I do object to this reasonable condition. Can I comment on that?
Yes, you can.
Okay. So I understand. We've come a really long way in a very long period of time, and I feel like that. Number one, this is a big ask. This is a $250,000 ask at a minimum. And that's a deal breaker for me. That's a lot of money. We've agreed to provide and meet to help reduce the carbon footprint by doing solar panels, by doing charging stations, by doing a white roof. There's roughly over probably $60,000 right there in improvements. Most of all, we have an agreement in the affordable housing sector of all this. And had we known that to pay for a stoplight would have been part of the approval, we could have factored that into our negotiations at that point because it is such a big ask. The timing of this and the fact that it's been decided in the last few days makes it kind of difficult to justify that. And so, with the affordable housing alone, that's probably over $1.5 million, $2 million commitment on our behalf, long term. That's a big number. So at some point, I have to understand this becomes a deal breaker for a big ask like that. And so, although I understand, I have to object to it, and those are my reasons as to why.
Okay, people can ask questions now. Thank you for the comment. Let's go now to questions from members on RC7. Are there any questions? Councilmember Rosenbarger.
I think this is for Jackie. Who normally pays for a stoplight like this if it's needed?
So yes, we discussed this internally. It's not incredibly common, but improvements that are required in the right-of-way because of a development are paid for by the developer, typically.
Question, Councilmember Smith.
Since I'm new to this, I asked this question not too long ago to somebody. the development is approved without the traffic signal commitment. The question I have is kind of at large, but perhaps to planning. In 5 years, in 2 years, if the traffic then warrants a signal, then, or it becomes very traffic problem, and so how does the city respond in that type of situation?
In the future, or at any time, if a signal were to be warranted here, then we would be responsible for paying for that and installing that. If I've said that incorrectly, our transportation and traffic engineer is here. He may be able to comment on that in more detail.
Good evening, Craig Schumparler, transportation and traffic engineer. So, yeah, I think Ms. Scanlon hit it right on the nail. Here's the thing, if in the future or even after this development's built and there's not a commitment in there for the developer, then the city would be on the hook for the cost of the signalization. And then that would compete against other projects that we all are wanting to do.
Okay, so I guess I asked that just because if people are worried about that and it is a deal breaker and we don't go that way, it's not that the neighborhood is left hanging. Eventually, there will be a response by the municipality and it will be addressed.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
It just gives, just to clarify, again, that's against competing resources. So that would mean that there, you know, it could be a timeline there in the future before that would get installed. It wouldn't be an immediate thing.
I understand. Thank you.
Councilmember Flaherty.
Yes, a few related questions. In the case of a by right development, something that is a permitted use, that let's say is roughly the same size or density of a project like this in the future, in those cases, is it ever required of the developer to pay for a traffic signal? I understand improvements in the right of way, like abutting the property, is probably a requirement. I guess I'm looking for a better understanding of what would be the difference in the case of a permitted use.
Sure, that's a fair question. I would have to review. Again, as I said, it's not very common that we have one project that's kind of tipped over the scale in my time here, where we've said, okay, a traffic light has to go in here. I can think of projects like, for example, at Patterson Point, where they had to improve all of the signalization for pedestrians at the large intersection immediately adjacent to their project. That is also a PUD. I would have to check the UDO and see if the improvements required by the UDO, even on by right projects, extend to something of that scale. I don't think that there's a particular exclusion, but most of the improvements that we normally look at are related to walkability, bikeability, and parking and landscaping in the right of way. So I'm not positive on that, but I can look into that.
Related follow-up, which is, I see how this is difficult in that if there is some level of traffic that will cross a threshold where we need a signal, it's sort of the latest comer who happens to walk across that threshold who is deemed potentially responsible. It might not be this project, actually, but even a smaller project nearby could tip that scale in the future. So it seems like a difficult problem to address in terms of who to require to pay for it, if anyone besides the city, which is not a question, except for that, I guess what are your thoughts about that? And then also following up on your statement of no objection to this reasonable condition, is there a, do you have strong feelings that it should pass? Does staff have particular feelings beyond no objection?
So to your first point, yes. I mean, it's not a perfect system. You know, to Council Member Smith's question, yes, we could end up paying for it with city money instead someday. You know, I don't, you know, there are lots of things in the city that require money just related to roads, you know, new paving, new sidewalks all over that compete every year for money. So if this went in and then it was immediately apparent that a light should have been put here, I think that would be, we would feel like that was a mistake. That now that is on the shoulders of the city to take care of that. I do understand that it's a big ask. So, you know, I understand that it's a big ask, may make it difficult for the developer, and it's going to have to be a decision that they would have to make if you choose to add that in. Based on the comments that we have presented at these meetings, so from Mr. Copper, who is the former interim transportation traffic engineer, and even Mr. Schunkweiler, based on preliminary look, they don't feel the light is likely to be warranted. I mean, that's not probably not going to keep Mr. Curry comfortable at night. That's not a final answer, but we do think that it's a risk not to, but yeah, it's a hard one for sure.
Thank you.
I'll take a chance. Oh, we got Councilmember Rosenbarger.
Ms. Scanlon, what happens if we don't put this in? Do most PUDs have a reasonable condition like this for infrastructure improvements?
Most PUDs, yes, have infrastructure improvements. This particular type, I could not think of off the top of my head of PUDs that we've seen in the last 5 years, but they do have infrastructure improvements. That is part of, all development does infrastructure improvement. This is just a kind of a unique situation with people being particularly concerned about one specific corner and the impact of a very specific development.
So if we didn't have it and a light was needed, would that be something planning and transportation would work out with the developer?
No, that would
Okay.
be something that the city
Would pay for.
work out with them ourselves.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll take a crack at this. First question is, how much does a light cost?
As Mr., is it Curry?
Yeah.
Tyler, I'm sorry. Indicated about $250,000, so about $250,000. That's a ballpark number.
So what are the warrants for the light, and how close is that intersection to the warrants now?
So keep in mind that we have limited data at this point. We'll back up in time. Right now we have some data from 2015-16 from some counts for 3 of 4 legs. We don't have all the legs there,
Okay.
all the counts. But some of the threshold volumes were close, were bumping up to the signal warrants. Signal warrants, there's basically 8 warrants. Basically, if we boil it down, it comes to constant demand of traffic.
Say that again?
Constant demand of traffic. You're looking over at least a 4 or 8 hour period, okay, of traffic. So let's talk a little bit about a traffic study. So what the traffic study would incorporate would be the counts, the existing traffic, so you have a base, and then they're going to load it, so add the additional trips created from this development. Now, there's one entrance there on Longview. The developer will anticipate which way they go out as they come out. Will they go to the west? Will they go to the east? They'll divide those trips. We will allow a reduction in trips due to bicycles use and transit use. Not a lot of communities will do that, but we are so we'll allow that. So then you add that in, and then you're seeing, will that then now trip the
Well,
traffic signal?
but just to clarify, I heard you say 2 things. One, that it's close to the warrants. The other is that it's not, the engineers didn't think it was that close. So which is it?
So what we're seeing, sir, is we're bumping the limits, but when we say that we're not sure, is that it's based, so typically traffic study is warranted when you see over 100 trips created in the peak hour. This type of development will likely meet that threshold, but we're not sure that the constant demand will be there. So with this type of development, we'll likely see an increase in the AM peak and the PM peak, but not maybe those hours in between. What we're asking for is that the developer prepare the traffic study to assure us, and then we will review it. And then if it does, through this process, warrant a signal, then we're saying, well, that's really on the developer, not the city, to do that.
Thank you.
Okay.
We got 30 seconds left in the question period before we go to public comment. Any final questions? If not, let's go to the public for comment. You'll have 2 minutes.
Hi, Steve Akers again from Park Ridge. We understand that this is a big ask, but we believe that at this intersection, it started as a two-way intersection. Then it became a four-way intersection so you have to stop at all four corners. What we're talking about is safety. We think the 100 cars per hour, that's easy. That's a no-brainer. I think we're already at the last count we've done was 7,000 or 8,000 a day. So the light is more about just people safely getting through the intersection all four ways around. And I think the tipping point is that we're talking about 300-plus residents and a 300-space parking garage that we're putting in, added to what we already have. To me, it's like it's a given. And I know this is a lot to ask, but this is a big complex. We wouldn't do it if it was just Needmore Cafe goes in. We want them to pay $200. We wouldn't do that. But this is a large, large complex. If that property were medical and it was offices that are only there during the day and they're empty at night, this wouldn't be an issue. But we're talking about 300 and some people living there added to the traffic that we already have. So, okay.
Thank you.
Hi, Greg Alexander. This reasonable condition is a ridiculous subsidy of automobiles. If somebody were to walk from this location, for example, to campus along the 7th Street Greenway, it's awesome that this is on the 7th Street Greenway, but there are no sidewalks on 17th Street or on 7th Street between Union and the bypass. They'd be walking in the street. It's not the worst street to do that, but especially at rush hour when there's a lot of people going to and from class or to and from jobs, that's a pretty nasty street to walk on, and there are no sidewalks on it. And there's like about 3 blocks of sidewalks on one side of the street. If somebody's going to the east, there's no sidewalks. If somebody's going to south to College Mall, they have to cross 3rd Street. We don't have like the most minimum crosswalk implementation there. It's completely for a pedestrian, they have this really crappy experience. And then you're saying, if we meet the warrants where we could build a stoplight, it would be a disaster if we didn't build that stoplight immediately. That's preposterous. We have been neglecting pedestrian infrastructure in the city for decades, and to say that the developer has to pay for any conceivable automobile use is preposterous. Thank you.
Connie Cook Glenn, Park Ridge neighbor. So just a couple of things. We talked last week about possibly reducing the number, you brought this up, Steve, of parking spaces. So I wonder if that is still on the table at all. And then I'm just going to throw out another idea. I'm sorry Tyler's not here right there. Oh, there he is. Good. Do you ever, in these cases, split costs? I mean, I suspect we already have the need for a light, and I think Steve and Jim also think the same. I mean, is that ever or at least we're on the border. Is that ever anything that happens? Maybe you know, Jackie? I don't know. Anyway, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you. I would ask that we address everyone by their surnames. Thank you. Any other public comment? If not, let's come back to council for a second round of questions. Councilmember Piedmont Smith.
I appreciate Ms. Cook-Glenn's suggestion, and am intrigued by the possibility of splitting the cost between the city and the developer should a traffic signal be warranted. Ms. Scanlon, has this ever been done, and do you see positive or negative aspects of this proposal?
Of splitting the cost? I'm not sure. To be honest, I don't know if that has been done. I don't know why that couldn't be done, but I think that would be a question for legal about how that would be done, how we could do that, and especially at this late stage, I'm not sure.
Mr. Schunkweiler, do you have any experience with splitting costs between a municipality and a private developer?
Yes, ma'am, I do. At a previous community that I worked in for 14 years, it was not uncommon to have the developer pay for the signals unless there was a development that the city, say, would benefit in the form of, say, sales tax. So an example would be a department store that would go in that there was a negotiated development agreement that said that then the city would pay for a portion of the signalization. Now that is unusual, but that would mean The reason that the community I worked with did that was to basically encourage that development so they could get more tax revenue.
Thank you.
Further questions? Councilmember Sandberg.
Petitioner. And that's an interesting point about sales tax. There are no taxes being generated from this property as it sits right now, and there will be with the development. But for the petitioner, when I hear the words deal breaker, if this were to pass, is it any other part of this project, which is pretty desirable, and you've already made quite a few accommodations, is there any other part of this project that would be in jeopardy if you were then asked to commit to this $250,000 public safety issue, which I frankly think the city should share?
You think the city should share?
I think that's a good idea, but
Okay.
we'll get to that in final
Yeah,
comment. My question to you is, what might you have to jettison from this project if this expense becomes truly burdensome, if it's asked of you?
Well, number one, it will generate a lot of property taxes when it's all said and done. That's one positive thing from more so than it's generating right now. But we have to start taking things out of the project. And so what are those? I mean, it might be finishes. I can't really change the modulation and the architecture that we've already presented, but it will boil down into, okay, do the rents increase to make up for it? Does the parking increase to make a parking rent increase to make up for it, to try and offset that? That hits people in the pocket. And what can I take out quality-wise that will help diminish that cost? Is it less expensive kitchen cabinets? Is it a less quality brick? Is it a less quality window? And so on and so forth. That's exactly what will happen. So don't want that to happen, but that's how we would have to start looking at things. Does that answer your question?
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Further questions on RC7? Councilmember Scambaluri.
For the petitioner as well, just to put a finer point on Councilmember Sandberg's question, is the notion of some kind of a split, be it 50-50 or 60-40 or whatever, is it even of interest to you to discuss that?
I'm not going to snub that. I mean, I think it's. I would be interested in having that conversation. That's better than the latter or the former. So.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that.
Further questions? Seeing none, we go to. Wait, is there a question, Councilmember Rallo? No, I had a comment. Okay. Councilmember Piedmont Smith.
I would like to move the vote on and final comment on this matter to after consideration of reasonable condition number 10.
Needs a second. Second. Can you explain why?
Well, reasonable condition number 10 has to do with reducing parking spaces, and I figure if we reduce parking spaces, we will have fewer cars, and then it is less likely that we will need a traffic signal. So I would like to see if that passes before voting on this one.
Any comments from members on the motion? It would just be a temporary one to put it after RC10. Councilmember Rallo?
I'm interested in hearing this now. I would like to hear a vote before we proceed to other reasonable conditions. But I had a comment to follow, but this might obviate that, so.
Any other questions or comments on the motion? Seeing none, do I hear a motion to close
Call the question.
Call a question. Can we have a vote to postpone to after RC10? Will the clerk call the roll?
Councilmember Rallo.
No.
Scambaluri.
Yes.
Rosenbarger.
Yes.
Sims.
No.
I'm sorry.
No. I'm sorry.
Bolin.
Yes.
Piedmont Smith.
Yes.
Flaherty.
Yes.
Smith.
Yes.
Sandberg.
Yes.
That's a 7-2 vote. We'll postpone it to after reasonable condition number 10. Thank you. I'm going to pass the gavel now, so I have to present the next two reasonable conditions. I move reasonable condition number 8. I need a second.
Second.
Thank you. Let me give myself 3 minutes here. It'll take 30 seconds. This is just an effort to make sure that the mechanicals are not visible from a distance. Too often I see a multi-story building like this, and the picture did not show the mechanicals, which are small but stick up another story. And I just want the mechanicals to be screened such that they will not be visible from the ground level. I might need to make this more specific to say from several blocks away, because standing right underneath it, no one can see the roof, let alone the mechanicals. I'm talking about from several blocks away. So with that, I'm happy to answer questions, but I'll ask staff and petitioner to comment on them.
No objection.
No objection.
Thank you. Have any, do we have council comments?
We have good questions first.
Questions from council? To my left, to my right. Okay, go to public for any public comment. Reasonable condition number 8. Okay, seeing none, going back to council for comments. Seeing none. Seeing none, no. Council, have a little levity, a little humor.
Oh, Councilmember Sims.
Councilmember Boland.
Last beer I buy you. Ms. Scanlon, what distance should be the appropriate distance? I mean, because it says not visible from ground level, but shouldn't I be more specific here?
Oh, I mean, if you want to be, you can. So from ground level, we would typically do from the sidewalk below normally if we're looking at something at mechanicals on the top of a building, we're looking from where the pedestrian would most likely be standing. So you could, but this is quite a tall building, so you probably wouldn't be able to see them. Yeah, it's kind of up to you. From the sidewalk across the street might be reasonable. It has to be shielded. Otherwise, yeah, I would say we typically, when we talk about that, it's more in the context of maybe like a historic structure or something on the square. You'd be looking from the sidewalk immediately adjacent to the building, figuring out the angle and then how far back it needs to be.
Mr. Curry, I don't want to change this right now. Can I get your assurance that the mechanicals won't be visible from, say, 3rd Street? Maybe your architect can answer the question.
I'm Alan Lupton. I'm the architect for the project. Typically what we do on these projects is try to locate all the rooftop mechanical units in the very center of the roof, because we have a center corridor. So we try to we do it for 2 reasons. One is to utilize the corridor runs for all the vertical runs we have to have. The other is we eliminate some noise issues of having the units sitting over the rooftops. So I'll guarantee you they will be centered on the roof masses as we go around, which should all but eliminate visibility, because as high as they are and as far as they're going to be 25 feet off the edge of the roof. But typically, when if there are, for some reason, we have to have them along the edges of the roof, we usually put some kind of a screen up there that's architecturally consistent with the facades. And I think the owner would agree to do that.
Well, the last question then I have for Ms. Scanlon is, will that affect their ability? Will that affect the height of the building?
To add a screen around the edge?
The mechanical itself might go above the height limit, but it doesn't really count towards the height limit.
No, that does not count against. The mechanical would not count against the height limit that they have included in the
So
ordinance.
for them to screen it might cause them to go above.
We typically do not count against that.
That reassures me. Thank you very much.
Councilmember Rollo.
Second.
Wait. Hang on. We did that too fast, like our chair slows things down. I do have a comment. This is for Ms. Scanlon. this reasonable condition as written is in compliance with our recently adopted UDO? And I'm just, as it's written what here, does that meet the needs? And I've heard a bunch of other stuff and screening and height and this and from blocks away. Does this, as it's written, meet what we passed in the recently adopted UDO?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, it's been,
Called and
question's
seconded.
been called in second. Okay, will you please call the roll? Ms. Clerk?
Councilmember Scambaluri,
Yes.
Rosenbarger,
Yes.
Sims,
Yes.
Bolin,
Yes.
Piedmont Smith,
Yes.
Flaherty,
Yes.
Smith,
Yes.
Sandberg,
Yes.
Rallo,
Yes.
Passes 9-0. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I move reasonable condition 10.
Second.
Been moved and seconded. Please present.
Thank you. So this one is sort of a more significant one. There's a blank in the condition. I've asked the petitioner, can they reduce the parking from 0.88 now to something close to 0.6? And can they, if they did so, that would also allow them to reduce the height of the building on the north side so as to reduce the shade being cast on the building to the north. What this actually does doesn't necessarily connect the two. It simply gives the developer the ability to reduce the height by reducing parking only without being forced to reduce the bed count. They also can reduce the height of the north side accordingly as they see fit. I think either way it works. I mean, the room they would need to reduce the impact of the north side of the building on Cambridge Square can and should come out of the parking, which I think is too high anyway. And if the parking is reduced, it might also reduce the potential for the warrants for a light at the corner of Pedals and Longview. Speaking with the petitioner, he expressed a willingness to go down to 0.63, which I would find acceptable. So I would be happy to write that number into the blank. The only questions I think we need to have answered are from the staff and the architect to talk about what they have in mind to reduce the impact of the building on the north side and how this might help with it. So with that, I'm happy to answer questions, but I'd certainly like to hear from staff and the petitioner on it.
After doing 6 reasonable conditions, this might sound a little odd, but most of you have heard this before. The administration position on reasonable conditions such as this, or the administration position on petitions that come to council, are that they should come out of Plan Commission in one form, and council should look at them and either approve them or deny them. I would argue that the 6 we went over are fairly kind of innocuous. I mean, they obviously would cost money, they require changes, but that this condition goes too far to change the petition from what the Plan Commission saw. Multiple levels of negotiation with a developer muddy the waters, make it difficult for us as planning and transportation staff to have those initial conversations with them when they know they will come here and have to have those conversations again, sometimes twice. That makes it more difficult for us to do our jobs over time. So for this particular condition, the administration and planning and transportation staff does not support the change of the building in this way. Thanks.
Do you want to hear from the petitioner?
Thank you, Ms. Scanlon. Petitioner, do you agree with what you just said, or do you have anything else to add, I guess I should say?
I do agree with Jackie.
Okay.
However, Mr. Volan, we've spoken about this. I'm okay with the parking ratio. I'm okay with reducing the parking. I have no problem with that. Any architectural changes and things, Mr. Lupton can speak to. But the parking ratio, I'm okay with.
Okay, thank you. Have any questions from council? Starting on my left, Councilmember Sandberg.
Can we separate the question then? If one element of this is acceptable to the petitioner, but the other is not, which I completely agree with staff, as someone who's been serving on the Plan Commission, any really major change in the design, I think, is very unfair to ask the petitioner at this stage of the project, which is quite good compared to where it was and how many changes they have made to make this the absolute best project I think it can be.
I'd like to respond to that.
Can we divide the question?
I'd like to respond.
Yes.
So if you'll note, the wording of the condition says the developer is invited to redesign. It's not required to. I don't think the question needs to be divided. If they choose not to redesign it, this condition doesn't make them. It does get them to agree to a smaller parking ratio, and while it would, and I'd like to hear from the architect about this, the opportunity of reducing the amount of parking in the garage without changing the number of units gives them a chance, if they see fit, to mitigate the north side of the building, which is something that the neighbors have said that they would like to see. It is literally a reasonable condition. So it doesn't compel them to change the side of the building, and I don't see why, if the petitioner wants to change the north side of the building, why staff or anyone would oppose it. So I wouldn't support splitting the question, because I think it kind of makes it's an invitation, not a requirement. The parking ratio would be a requirement.
Councilmember Flaherty.
Yeah, a question for both Ms. Scanlon and the petitioner. One is, the petitioner stated no objection to this condition, but I'm curious if he has a desire to have a lower parking ratio. Is that actually what your choice would be if given any choice? And if so, for staff, would this condition not existing, would the planned unit development adoption prevent the reduction of a parking ratio? In other words, could Mr. Curry pursue a reduction of the parking ratio of his own initiative because he wants to with no reasonable condition here at all? Would that meet the code that we are looking at today?
Okay, so great questions. When we discussed this a little bit after Land Use Committee, I believe that the way that what I suggested to the petitioner was that to review the petitioner's statement, to review the proposed district ordinance. We are doing an ordinance, we are not approving a site plan. So if your ordinance creates a box in which a building can be built, then you could build a smaller building, because we're not saying it has to be this one way. That gets complicated in issues where it's one site like this, and we're looking at very detailed architectural drawings. If they have in their petitioner statement committed to building this building, that makes it a little harder for us to let them make changes. But if there's an understanding that it's more of kind of like a broad view of this is what we would like as our maximum outline, then we would be open to letting it be smaller. They didn't make any changes to the statement as far as I know. I can review that quickly. My understanding is that it was written for this building initially. There may be a reasonable condition to say, that the district ordinance could be construed as all maximums related to height, bulk, density, parking, in which case then if they wanted to lower any of those, then they would be allowed to do so. And I think that that is what a PUD ordinance should be doing, so we would be open to that as well, to Mr. Boland's point.
Mr. Curry wishes to address my question as well about his desire, absent objections. Does that make sense? Not just whether or not you object to the reasonable condition, but what your actual preference is. Would you prefer, given the choice, to pursue a lower parking ratio? Or if you're unsure, that's okay too.
I mean, that's a tough question. I can make this work with a lower parking ratio. I can. And I think that, yeah, if you said, how many parking spaces do you want, and just do it, the sky, I don't think that's really an option. That's not going to happen here. So I'm okay with, lowering the parking ratio. I walk away happy. It works for me. did I answer the question?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
It's a bit tricky.
Councilmember Piedmont Smith.
Yes, I have a question for the sponsor. Mr. Volan said that since the wording is the developer is invited to redesign the site, it is therefore not a requirement. But then Mr. Volan also said that the reduction of the parking ratio to 0.63 would be required. And that doesn't make any sense to me because that's in the same sentence as invited to redesign.
I see that now. Yeah, I mean, I would like to make, if he's willing to commit to 0.63, I'd like to make that the upper limit. So I would have to reword this. But, yeah, I can.
Wow.
I was going to ask Mr. Sherman if I want to reword my own, because I've got the blank here, if I want to say, actually, I think it does work with the wording as it is. He's invited to redesign. Maybe it should just say, I mean, by reducing could be interpreted as he would be required to reduce it. It's a little awkwardly phrased, but you know, if we can find a word to enshrine that, that's the goal here.
Isn't a reasonable condition or an amendment supposed to be in writing specific so that we can consider this? This is ad hoc negotiation at the last possible moment, and I'm very uncomfortable with that. I mean, this should have been specified during the Land Use Committee. Isn't that correct, Mr. Chairman?
I think the way to resolve this is to actually vote to amend to fill in the blank. That way it's, so.
No, I object. I think that this should have been specified. It's not to be specified at the moment, it seems to me. This should have been a specific amendment that should have been in writing before the meeting began. I'm totally unprepared to do the guesswork at this point, and I don't think anyone here is. Thank you.
If I may respond.
Councilmember Sandberg.
I would ask this council, given what we've heard, and I think it's often in the petitioner's advantage to lower their parking. It's less expensive to build a smaller garage than a larger one. I think they're probably willing to do that. Would we all be willing to accept a gentleman's agreement that since the wording is invited to, we're not demanding they do anything, but just suggesting it, can we dispense with this altogether and be comfortable with their saying we'll reduce that parking ratio to the extent that we can, just not get into design elements, which I agree is totally inappropriate at this stage of this project. And I think it does a disservice to the Plan Commission and the planning staff and the petitioners for us to be asking this kind of micro elements of these details at this point. So if we're not willing to do that, you know, I think I'm going to have to vote no on this.
Councilmember Volan, respond to Councilmember
I disagree
Rallo.
emphatically with what's been asserted by Councilmember Rallo, that we have on many an occasion changed wording of reasonable conditions in the past, and that this is not in any way unusual. The fact that the number is left out was as a courtesy to the developer who I asked for a 0.6, and in fact that was at a public meeting, out loud, 0.6. You know, and the fact that I'm willing to put a number in that's higher than what I was asking for, I think is also very reasonable. I agree with the developer that 0.63 is a reasonable number, and it's a reasonable thing to put the number in here right now. I apologize for the miswording of it, but we've also done, how many times have we done friendly amendments? I'm sorry, Councilmember Rallo, I disagree with you completely on this. It's perfectly in order.
And it's okay to disagree. Councilmember Piedmont Smith.
Yes, I also want to disagree with Councilmember Rallo, and we have reasonable conditions written out. We had them sketched out already on Friday. The committee, the Land Use Committee, worked very hard to get them all written out tonight. The fact that there were a few blanks is still a vast improvement over other meetings we've had where we wrote completely new reasonable conditions and amendments on the fly. So I think that it is not a fair characterization. on his part.
Mr. Chair, I move an amendment to reasonable condition 10.
Actually, I still have comments, if we still are allowed to do that.
Sure.
Everyone has a right to agree to disagree with whatever they've heard or whatever their colleagues have said. I tend to, since others have made their points, I tend to see this closer to Councilmember Rallo. It seems like we're getting closer and closer to renegotiating design, renegotiation, things that the Plan Commission has already done, some things that our own Land Use Committee has agreed upon. And I think if we're going to have reasonable conditions, and I'm not saying they're unreasonable or whatever, but they should be documented in the way that we should be considering them. I mean, before we get done with this one here, we would have basically changed it 3 different ways. And I think that's the unreasonable part. So just my comment. Anything? Councilmember Boland.
I move to amend the reasonable condition. The second line should read, side by committing to reduce the parking space to bedroom ratio to no more than 0.63. That is the text that's missing, and that clarifies it. The whole sentence would read, the developer is invited to redesign the building to reduce the height along the north side by committing to reduce the parking space to bedroom ratio to no more than 0.63. That is the intent. And this was discussed at Land Use Committee. The idea was floated. It's a known quantity. What Councilmember Rallo is objecting to is the simple blank space here. Councilmember Piedmont Smith makes a good point that occasionally there are slip-ups and we have to correct them. We've had friendly amendments all throughout 2019. This is no exception. I ask for a second.
Second.
It's been moved in second. Clerk, please call the roll.
No, we have to
I'm
discuss
sorry.
it.
Have to
Discuss it. It's an amendment.
I thought we just discussed it.
It's,
Okay, sorry. Council comments or debate? Councilmember Rallo.
Yes, it's not just simply a blank space. It's a means by which one could even call it extortion, because we were hearing another amendment, but that was transferred to the end of the debate, and now the developer is having to negotiate a very significant, I think, aspect of this development that could jeopardize it. It's not insignificant. It's enormous
Point of order.
consideration. And this is may I make a comment? Finish my comment?
Well, you're not commenting on the motion that's on the table.
I am. And the motion on the table is to specify a number. And I think that this whole process is out of order, it seems to me. I mean, this should have been negotiated and decided beforehand and not at this moment, which is anyone's guess. I don't want to jeopardize this development, so I will be voting abstain, I suppose, or no. I'll be voting no on this.
Point of information, it is in writing, so you can proceed.
could you read it to us? Just the first sentence?
The developer is invited to redesign the building to reduce the height along the north side by, new words, committing to reduce the parking space to bedroom ratio to no more than 0.63. Is that correct?
Thank you.
Okay.
Land Use Committee, if we're going to allow them to add units, you would need to address the density because they're already at the top of what they are proposing for this PUD. And I apologize, I didn't mention that earlier today.
There's no way for them to reduce the height by
there
adding
is, but
density.
I thought the idea was to reduce the height, add units, take out parking.
No, all this does is it allows them to reduce the height without requiring them to reduce the number of bedrooms or units.
Got it. Thank you for clarifying that.
That's not necessary.
Perfect.
Now, we took council comment.
Your comment on the amendment, yes.
Councilmember Flaherty.
I actually have a question, which is, would it be, I take Ms. Scanlon's point and others' concerns about redesign issues at this stage in the game. That said, I'm amenable to treating all of the conditions in this planned unit development as maximums, the size and density and parking spaces. but which Ms. Scanlon said staff would also be generally favorable towards in the context of planned unit developments and perhaps the way it should be done. But my understanding is that at this point, that is not the way this one was done. Is it possible to change that, scrap this reasonable condition, and just clarify that all of the upper limits, density, minimum, density, height, parking spaces are all considered maximums, such that if petitioner wanted to reduce any of them, it could. Is that possible to do in this meeting, or is that too much? I don't know. That's my question. I don't know who would like to answer it.
I don't favor it.
Nobody's, the sponsor said he doesn't favor to answer or your intent. I'm not so sure. Do we have any more comments?
Just a question, comment. So we will essentially have two motions before us. One is whether or not to approve your amendment. The second is whether or not to approve this reasonable condition, correct?
First and then second, correct.
Okay. We now go.
We have to go to the public, yeah.
Go to the public for any public comments.
I'm Greg Alexander. Since this seems to be a procedural question, the legal profession kind of deals with this problem all the time, and procedure goes out the window if there's no adversary. If nobody's saying we shouldn't restrict the parking, we shouldn't reduce the parking requirement, if nobody makes that assertion, then nobody actually cares about the procedure. You know, if you had sprung this on the petitioner and they said, whoa, then what Mr. Arlo says would have a significant merit, but that's not at all what's happened here. The petitioner said, all right, and so I simply don't understand why there's a procedural issue here at all. Thank you.
So I'm Connie Cook Glenn. I will have to admit I'm completely confused. But I have a couple of questions. So when the petitioner came in this evening, he had some ideas of reducing the height. And so we never actually heard what that was. So that's just kind of a practical question. And what the impact would be on the shade. I very much support this idea of having reduced parking so that he can increase the apartments themselves and still keep the building smaller. But I feel like those two basic questions have not even been a part of the discussion. And perhaps you have it in your packet and we just haven't heard it. That's entirely possible. And I just want to remind us that all of these things we have been discussing. So I respect Mr. Rallo's opinion and ideas that, we came through these other committees, but we were here for 3 different committees, and these comments were coming up, and the petitioner heard them, so I don't feel like this is a new discussion, even though maybe the specific numbers were not there, although you had the specific numbers there. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I think it's back to council comment. Councilmember Scambolari.
Thank you. I am inclined, with this being Councilmember Volan's reasonable condition, if he sees fit to add an amendment to it, I don't have any problem supporting that. What I keep coming back to, Ms. Scanlon, is your comment that this reasonable condition overall is reaching too far and makes it difficult for you to be the planning staff. Could you comment on that, please?
I think myself and other members of staff for the administration have made similar comments. We had the lunch session about committees semi-recently. Our experience has been working with developers of all scales that it kind of makes it difficult. It kind of takes away some of the teeth of what we're doing when they have an expectation that they will come here and more negotiation will be done. And so I know the mayor's office has been pretty clear for a while now that the preference is we bring things to you, you either like them or you don't. You know, whether or not that's can be fully exactly that every time. But in this case, I think this feels like a large change. I mean, it's basically removing a half a floor of a 4-story building. that to be done at this stage.
So what you as a planning staff member are saying is that reasonable condition 10 reaches beyond what you would recommend at this stage of the game?
Yes.
Thank you.
Any more council comments? I think, well, actually, and I'll let you do that. I just wanted to, this second amendment, let me reread it to make sure we're not as confused. And I think it should read, the developer is invited to redesign of the building to reduce the height along the north side by committing to reduce the parking space to bedroom ratio to no more than 0.63, and the rest of it goes unchanged.
Correct.
Okay. Now, Councilmember Piedmont Smith.
Call the question.
Second.
Questions have been called in second. Can the clerk please call the roll?
This is on the amendment, correct?
Correct.
Yes.
Amendment to
Councilmember
RC10.
Rosenbarger?
Yes.
Sims?
No.
Volin?
Yes.
Piedmont Smith?
No.
Flaherty?
Yes.
Smith?
No.
Sandberg?
No.
Rallo?
No.
Scambalori?
Yes.
Fails.
4-5.
4-5.
I think it's, is that the number you get?
So I still have to fill in the blank in order to consider, I mean,
What number did you get?
4-5.
Four,
was
five.
4-5.
Thank you. Okay, that amendment fails. Now we're back to the original reasonable conditions, is that correct? Yes, Mr. Sponsor.
I find the situation absurd, because this is because I didn't properly word it before the meeting, and my own amendment failed. There's still a blank in the form. So in order to put a blank in there, I have to amend again. We have to have another vote. So effectively, this is killing the amendment. I'm mind-boggled by this turn of events.
So am I, and that's what it appears to me. Do I have any further comments? Councilmember Rallo.
Yes, I'd just like to agree. I'm mind-boggled as well. Thank you.
Councilmember Flaherty. I'm sorry, were you complete? Were you done? I'm sorry. Councilmember Flaherty.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that I agree with Mr. Volan's point that, and which is why I voted yes on the amendment, that he should be allowed to amend the language as he sees fit. But I do plan to vote no on the reasonable condition for reasons staff cited and others. But I thought any amendment was reasonable. So I'm not sure that is how everybody understood the vote that just happened. But I take Mr. Volan's point that now, or Councilmember Volan's point, that now there is essentially like no reasonable condition to vote on because we don't have a filled-in blank.
Councilmember Volan.
Part of the reason I'm boggled is because here is a reduction that achieves a planning goal of reducing dependence on parking. And planning is saying that they prefer that we observe this idea that the council should never adjust anything, which is simply a preference of the administration, but entirely within the capacity of the council to make changes. Yes, they don't prefer that council negotiate at the end, but here was a negotiation that was reasonably accepted, that the petitioner was willing to do, that would reduce dependence on the automobile. I just have never been in a situation like this before, and I am I don't know what to say. I don't know what to say.
Councilmember Piedmont Smith.
I would like to propose an amendment to reasonable condition 10, and that would be to simply fill in the blank with 0.63.
Second.
May I make a comment? I don't know who to ask. Mr. Sims?
Yes, I think you can.
Thank you. So in the district ordinance, the section related to number of parking spaces says the internal parking garage is expected to have no more than 102 spaces per floor and no more than a total of 306 spaces. So that's a maximum, right? Let's see. and then they have a maximum number of DUEs and an expected number of units, which would be a maximum as well. So I feel that it's possible that with this language, we could see this as what I was discussing earlier. Could this be construed as a guidance box, which is what it's supposed to be? And that if they choose to build smaller, based on the guidance and discussions they've had with Council Member Volin, do you need a reasonable condition for them to do that?
What is the maximum that could go in that box? Am I asking
Sorry,
the
say
right-
that again?
What is the maximum that could go in that box? Am I asking the right question?
So for example, so the things that would be, they're not planning to change number, so for Mr. Volin's idea, the number of units wouldn't be changed, so that wouldn't
Correct.
change. So the things that would change would be height bulk, which would just be smaller, so height of the back, and number of parking spaces, right? So the number of parking spaces is already variable, since they're giving a maximum in their district ordinance. Maybe what we should be discussing is just to clarify that the height that they've included, which is just not to exceed 4 stories, and then they give specific heights so that you can have an idea of what the building is. But to clarify that is to as well be a maximum. And then in that case, they could reduce that. It seems to me that they could reduce it without a reasonable condition, is what I'm trying to say.
Thank you.
I'd like to reply to this.
Councilmember Volin.
If they were to reduce it, would it not go against the very argument that you made, Ms. Scanlon, that they're redesigning the building after you approved it?
No, the argument that I have made on behalf of the administration is that we would prefer that this body doesn't redesign or change rules after it comes out of Plan Commission. But what this petition is supposed to be doing is setting a list of guidelines within that a petitioner can work within to build something.
And all
Like
I'm-
on a PUD that's 80 acres, where they're saying area A is going to be residential, area B is going to be commercial. They're just setting guidelines for those areas. This becomes more complicated because it's one small lot, and so they're compelled to give a lot of information, and then we get in the weeds when we really should be talking about what I'm now apparently just calling the box of where they can build. So I don't what I'm saying is we would prefer that you all don't make a mandate and change things.
But all I'm doing is changing a guideline. I'm reducing the guideline from .88 to .63. Why is that so objectionable?
Well, I'd like to ask a question if I can before we do that, and I'd like to defer to our Council Plan Commission rep. How do you see this, if it's proper for me to ask that?
Well, I certainly agree with staff on this.
Okay. It's reasonable to me. Any more comments? Sorry, we
Call the question on Councilmember Piedmont Smith's amendment to fill in 0.63 on the reasonable condition, such that we can then vote on something.
Second.
Okay, it's been moved in second. Will the clerk please call the roll? Are we clear on what we're voting on? Okay, she says I'm just counting. Okay, it'd be .063 in the box, and then we're, gotcha.
Okay. Councilmember Volin,
Yes.
Piedmont Smith,
Yes.
Flaherty,
Yes.
Smith,
No.
Sandberg,
Yes.
Rallo,
No.
Scambalori,
Yes.
Rosenbarger,
Yes.
Sims,
No.
Passes 5-4.
Thank you. Passes 5-4.
Call the question on the reasonable condition as amended.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded.
What?
Do we go?
I'm sorry. Did we skip public comment on the reasonable condition as opposed to the, okay. We may have, I may have been too antsy to call the question. I don't know if we had public comment on the reasonable condition itself as opposed to the previous amendment to the reasonable condition? It seems like perhaps not.
Okay, yes, ma'am, it's now public comment. Now, just so that I'm clear, Dan or Mr. Sherman, on what it is that, which amendment are we commenting on?
This is 10 as amended.
This is the one
10
that
as
fills in the
amended.
blank.
Okay.
This is 10 as amended with the .63 in the blank.
The process of staff and plan commission is not sacred. It's only good if you like the result. There's a development, I can see it from my front porch, actually. It's behind Upland. I honestly, I don't remember what they called it. It's a large apartment building. It's actually very similar to this. It's got a parking garage in the middle of a large student-oriented apartment building. A little different because it's more oriented towards students. And I went there last year, right before Little 500, the week before Little 500, and I counted the garage, and it has, just off the top of my head, I think it was 353 spaces. And I counted it different times a day. I was thinking that I would probably find the absolute highest occupancy at night for Little 500 because people come to visit, and so there will be visitors there. And I did, and it was 52% full. That was the highest that I counted. This was during the semester. This was not, it had been open a couple of years, it had occupancy. So we had built a garage that was literally twice as big as the peak demand because we had gone through this process with staff. This is not like a personal dig on staff. This is a systemic problem with the entire planning profession, that they systematically overestimate how much parking will be used. And it's such a disaster when we build. I can't even tell you how big this garage is, and to know that it's half empty, that it was a complete waste, that the developer is losing money on a half-empty garage, that the people who live there are being subsidized to use their cars because there's a half-empty garage. I don't like that result. I don't think you should say that just because staff has spent time on this, that we can't intervene. We have to intervene. It's a catastrophe when we build an oversized parking garage. Thank you.
I wanted to say thank you to everyone for having really carefully considered this building, and for those of you who are not at land use, I'll remind you that the building next to it deserves its own protection, and I'm speaking on their behalf. I'm the Lorax, except for the elderly, who are also low income, so could we please remember that? I think what Tyler has designed is a beautiful solution, and I'm really grateful to you, Tyler, for doing that. Steve, the way you've worked it out with the parking is great. I think this idea that the city doesn't like intervention by the city council goes against democracy. So I would really encourage you to go with this as a positive development, as something that meets a lot of people's needs, as Steve was talking about earlier. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further public comment? Seeing none, I think we come back to council for a final comment.
Call the question.
Councilmember Volan.
I don't have an objection to staff. I do have an objection to this administration's policy, which says that council should not intercede in a PUD because it should all have been decided before it came to council. If so, what's the point of it coming to council? Well, the answer is we have a statutory authority to review it. And this is a policy interpretation of the administration that has resulted in an absurd result, that even though the developer was willing to commit to the maximum, we refused to compel it by changing two words that I left out of this amendment, and that the objection was on procedural grounds. What some members of council are saying is we should not, I mean, here's the thing. The administration says we should either deny it or approve it, but not change it. But how many times have we seen a PUD that just needed a fix, one fix, and we've done several fixes here that they didn't object to. So I mean, why do they support any other reasonable conditions? Okay? The logic here is not about this project, which this was a reasonable condition. It was literally considered reasonable by the petitioner. I certainly thought it was reasonable. I don't know why. I mean, so the upshot of the staff objection, of the administration objection, is we don't like it because you're threatening our ability to negotiate with developers. I'm sorry, but either we have the authority to review this or we don't. So now, we can't say the council rejected committing to reduce. I hope the developer will see that there is a savings in 0.63, and I hope staff will allow him to change his building even though it was approved with 0.88. We all know that too much parking is bad. This is a way of reducing it. I'm just dumbfounded by this turn of events. I urge you to support RC10.
Councilmember Flaherty.
I don't think I'm going to vote yes on this reasonable condition, and I just wanted to clarify that it's because of Ms. Scanlon's confirmation that, as drafted, petitioner will be able to pursue a smaller footprint if he would like. He seems amenable to that, but it does seem difficult from a process and the stage of negotiations at this point for me. So I'm going to vote no, but I'm heartened by Ms. Scanlon's interpretation that they can go less should they see fit.
Councilmember Piedmont Smith.
Yes, so we have here a developer who would like to reduce the parking. We have as a publicly stated goal to decrease dependence on automobile use. We have as a reasonable condition, the developer is invited to redesign the building. This is a statement. If we pass this, I think it's a statement saying we would like to see a redesign of the building and a reduction of parking, which I totally agree with. I do want to see a reduction in parking. I do want to emphasize non-automotive modes of transportation, as we have stated over and over again in our plans as a city. And I do not find that this is changing things in an unreasonable way at the last minute. This is inviting to redesign. This is not saying, okay, it is 10:32 and we're going to do this many feet here and this many feet. No, it is inviting to redesign. I think this is totally reasonable, and I'm going to vote for it, and I encourage my colleagues to do the same.
Do you have any further comments? Councilmember Rollo.
I have never recalled a time when there was a reasonable condition with a blank within it that was negotiated in such a ad hoc, unpredictable fashion. I wonder why this hadn't been worked out by the Land Use Committee before. Isn't this the point of having a Land Use Committee to come before us with something specific instead of this last moment sort of negotiation? So I object to that process, and I hope we don't witness it again. It is completely novel. Never seen it before. Thank you.
Thank you. And if I just may briefly comment, I don't find Ms. Scanlon's opinion to be binding of the administration's policy. I think it's just her opinion as been discussed with her supervisor, which is the administration mayor is their supervisor. And that is her opinion. That's what we ask her to do that, and I don't think it has compelled us to go one way or another. We just asked her what she thought about it, and she told us. Okay, so it's pretty simple. Okay. How many bites of apple is that? Councilmember Volan.
I will remind Councilman Barallo that in November 2016, we took up the question of Park South. the Lockley project, that was a big debate between the developer and Bryant Park Neighbor Association. And we were literally negotiating the project at 1 o'clock in the morning. And in fact, I have nicknamed the resolution that created the Land Use Committee the let's not debate railings and planters at 1 o'clock in the morning. So the fact that he's not seen a blank in an RC before is frankly misleading. We have absolutely negotiated, and I frankly don't blame the administration for not wanting to see those negotiations again. That is why I proposed the Land Use Committee in the first place. And I think it's done a decent job of preventing late meetings. I just want to remind everyone of that. Support this amendment. Thank you.
Okay.
Call the question.
Second. Questions have been called and second. Would the clerk please call the roll?
Councilmember Bowman.
Yes.
Piedmont Smith.
Yes.
Flaherty.
No.
Smith.
No.
Sandberg.
No.
Rallo.
No.
Scambaluri.
No.
Rosenbarger.
Yes.
Sims.
No.
3-6.
Fail 3-6.
Thank you. We now bring back RC number 7. We were in final comment on RC number 7. This was the condition that
Well-
would require the light.
Just point of order before we go. Do we need to do anything to extend time, or are we in the middle of it?
10:30, we're in the middle of it. We can't introduce anything new after 10:30, but this was already introduced. And then after that comes the final vote on the
You
ordinance
just
as a whole.
introduced it. I was just getting clarification, so. okay.
No, it was introduced and we postponed it.
Okay.
Councilmember Piedmont Smith.
Yes, I would like to move an amendment to reasonable condition 7.
Second.
I would like to, let me get it. So the text would read, "The developer shall record a written commitment agreeing to pay half the cost of a traffic signal at the intersection of Pete Ellis Drive and Longview Avenue in the event the traffic study called for by the Plan Commission as a condition of approval shows the need for one."
Is there other questions for the maker of the motion? On my right? On my left? No questions? Is there a public comment on the amendment to RC?
Can we hear from the petitioner?
Oh, sorry. Can we hear from staff first?
I'm sorry, I was writing, I missed. Will you please read that again?
The developer shall record a written commitment agreeing to pay half the cost of a traffic signal
That's what
at
I
the
thought you said.
intersection if the traffic study calls for it.
What says staff?
I mean, and that's a big difference as far as cost, so without being a subject matter expert, I would feel uncomfortable saying one way or the other, to be honest.
The petitioner have an opinion on this amendment to RC 7?
I still think it's a big ask. I do. I still think it's a very big ask. And it may affect my ability to reduce parking. It may affect my ability to produce art on the wall. These are the things that will have to be considered. There's a lot of development that's going to happen in that area. It's just my opinion. I feel it's just a huge ask still this late in the game. Thank you.
I do have a question to the sponsor. And thank you for that, I guess, but my question is, if the traffic increased there along Pete Ellis due to this, or where this project is located, but at some point with what we're doing further north, and Pete Ellis is going to be like a main road to get to Range Road, which will get you to the hospital, which I think is naturally going to increase traffic, then are we potentially holding this petitioner for half of the cost that could be contributed to the hospital development by using that roadway? I guess it's just a reasonable question I'm just trying to figure out. Because if he agrees to it and it's really not the cost to him by his project, then what percentage are we talking? If what I said made sense. I mean, I'm just thinking.
Yeah, I understand your question. I think it's
Because
impossible.
traffic is going to increase. We
Yeah.
already know that. But how much are we going to attribute to this project?
It's impossible to say.
That's kind of what I was thinking. Okay, thank you.
Further questions for the sponsor or for anyone regarding this amendment to RC7? Councilmember Sandberg.
Do we know what commitment the hospital has in making road improvements all around the area? I mean, this is kind of a symptom of that whole development. We're anticipating that there's going to be more need for housing due to the increased
who are you
employment
asking?
opportunities of the hospital. So, do we know what the hospital's commitment is to help out with the congestion in the neighboring area?
No, I don't think I have an answer.
That's yet to be determined, or has that just never been discussed, or?
I'm certain it's been discussed. I don't think I'm privy to any of those particular discussions. I would point out that a traffic study done at this location now would not be taking into effect the cars that may be using this road in 5 years.
Right.
It would be based on the effects that are expected from this development with today's traffic. I mean, not that we shouldn't be looking forward, but that the numbers shown in a traffic study wouldn't be reflecting what may come, is my understanding.
Yeah, please.
So, I feel like I'm your advisor, and I'm cautious on the 50% share at this point. The reason is I view it as a slippery slope for other developments. So we begin to set a precedence that can lead into other developments down the road. I would say it's a little risky for me, but I would rather you require the traffic impact study, but not put the condition in there that the developer be on the hook if you're going to put anything at this point, because we need to basically circle within and figure out how we handle future developments. Where I'm from before, we would negotiate this out before we came to this point. And that's where my concern is, if we set a precedent here at 50%, and then we have another development in 3 months, and then we say, well, that developer will say, well, you gave that guy a break, and we just kind of begin this snowball effect. So I just am saying at this point, I think just from my professional judgment and talking with these folks, I mean, at least do the study. We can then, I don't know, this is risky on my part, because I guess the part is that we fail, and then the city's on the hook at some point for this, but I'm just cautious about naming a share at this point.
Councilmember Sandberg.
When you say we can do the study, who's the we? Who's responsible for now doing the study?
I meant these folks do the study.
And that's already underway, or that's part of it, or?
That was a condition.
So it is already a condition of approval that they will do a traffic study at the development plan stage, and then that would be reviewed by planning and transportation staff. So I believe the intent for Ms. Piedmont-Smith is giving that condition teeth. So the condition just says they're going to do one. So if it shows there's going to be a detrimental effect in this area, the condition doesn't say what's going to happen after that. So this was an attempt to.
Got it. And that was a part of the original, that
is one of the Plan Commission conditions.
Thank you. Thank you.
Councilmember Rosenbarger.
Sorry, I sort of asked this the first time around, but I just want to be clear, you said that it is normal for the developer to pay for something like this.
I would say that, again, having a development put in a stoplight is atypical for the types of developments we've been doing in the last 5 years, but developers are responsible for improvements, installation, and paying for improvements in the public right-of-way that are deemed required for their developments. For example, that is usually pedestrian and bicycle-oriented landscaping. But I did have the example where I believe at Patterson Point, they were required to install the crosswalk, update that signal for crosswalk. I think that there is some language in the UDO that could potentially be interpreted that it's kind of up to staff and CBU. It's in a section that discusses planning and transportation and CBU, and I think typically we talk about utilities being required as CBU utilities in that section. And I would have to talk to legal about whether or not that extends to something like a traffic light.
Okay, and just a follow-up. Did you discuss this at all with the petitioner in the beginning stages, or did this come up at Plan Commission? Who would pay?
So when we did, thank you for asking that, we talked about it a little bit at Land Use Committee. When we were doing the review for Plan Commission, we had an internal discussion about whether or not a traffic study should be required at that stage. It was determined at that time that one was not required because it was unlikely to warrant a new signal at this location. Plan Commission was uncomfortable with that, and so we added the condition that one needs to be done at the development plan stage.
Further questions on the amendment to RC7? Seeing none, we'll go to the public for comment on the amendment to RC7 to change half the cost of the signal.
Hi, Greg Alexander. There's on the order of 10,000 people that live within a half mile of College Mall, and they all drive to get to College Mall because the roads there are so crap. Like, this is the city's fault that there's too much traffic on Pete Ellis. This is a problem that's been decades in the making. This is not something caused by this development. This is an existing problem from our city's consistent misallocation of resources, and half of too much is still too much. Thanks.
Further public comment? Back to the council for debate. Any final comments? Councilmember Piedmont Smith.
Well, we wouldn't be in this predicament if a traffic study had been required before approval by the Plan Commission, which I fervently believe should have been the case. I am not comfortable in this position now because I don't want to disapprove the project, and I get the feeling that if we approve this reasonable condition, we're going to have a less high-quality project because he's going to cut corners in other ways. I really feel backed into a corner here. I feel like the due diligence that should have been done earlier in the process was not done, and so I'm trying to control my resentment. Resentment is bad. Let it go. But I'm not even sure how I'm going to vote on this, but I'm very uncomfortable to be in this position. I feel like there is a chance that due to the 300-plus new residents here, many of whom are going to drive, we're going to need a traffic signal. There's a chance of that. A traffic signal is also beneficial for pedestrians. It's not just for cars. So even if the developer reduces the parking ratio, there's still going to be 300-plus people living there and trying to get around in various ways. So yes, it's impossible to say, 50% of this traffic or getting us to the warrants is 50% the fault, quote unquote, of this new development. No, I don't know. It might be 30%, might be 60%, or we might not meet the warrants. There are so many uncertainties. That's why there should have been a traffic study before we got to this point. Drives me crazy. Okay, so that's all I have to say. I'm not sure how I'm gonna vote on my own amendment.
Councilmember Rallo.
I'm uncomfortable with this imposition because of potentially compromising other aspects of this project. That's my first point. Second point is referring back to Councilmember Flaherty's comment earlier, is that can the burden be placed on the single developer, since obviously there are other contributors to traffic in that area. Keeping in mind that this will result in more tax revenue that could be used for that purpose. I agree that traffic studies are a very important aspect of a very large-scale development. We really, that would be helpful to us. And then my last point is back to Mr. Alexander's first comment. where he said there was no pedestrian infrastructure on 7th Street. There is a sidewalk between Union and Hillside. It's lacking between Hillside and the bypass, but more importantly, we passed a bond last year that establishes a side path that runs all the way from the near west side to this development, essentially. So, thank you.
Councilmember Smith.
And I believe that it is in the city should be responsible for public safety. And burdening one developer, I'm going to just tag team on that one, burdening one developer for the cost of the signal when honestly, IU Health may have a larger impact on that intersection than the building. And so I'm going to be voting no for this amendment.
Further
This condition.
debate on the amendment to RC7.
Call the question.
Let me just say one thing. I would just say that, if it causes the developer to not be willing now that he only has the option but is not required to reduce parking, then I'm suddenly in the absurd position of being against requiring him to do the traffic light, because I think that reducing the parking in the building is going to be a more environmentally beneficial thing than putting in the traffic light. So I'm going to, I could vote for this, but I'm going to oppose RC7 either way. With that, we have a motion and a second. Will the clerk call the roll on the amendment to RC7?
Councilmember Piedmont Smith,
Yes.
Flaherty,
Yes?
Smith,
No.
Sandberg,
No.
Rallo,
No.
Scambaluri,
Yes.
Rosenbarger,
Yes.
Sims,
No.
Volin,
Yes. Is that 5-4? Okay, so it's amended to half, to agreeing to pay for half the traffic signal. We
Yes.
now come back to RC7 as amended. Are there any last questions on RC7 as amended? Councilmember Sims.
I have one. Just out of curiosity, I'd like to know what the petitioner thinks, where we stand now.
I think he's already said it.
I said he said about $250,000. How does he feel about $125,000?
Mr. Curry?
And I heard what he said the first time, so
Okay.
don't try to put that in. I heard what he said.
Well, if you ask me, would you rather spend $125,000 or $250,000, I'd probably take the $125,000. This is all based on if it's required. It may not be required.
Gotcha. Okay.
So what's my risk, right? So I don't know yet, and it's going to be determined. But I still think it's a lot of money, and I still oppose to it. But I will tell you this, and I give you my word, I will reduce the parking. So I still will give you my word that I will do that. So thank you.
Further questions on RC7 as amended? Seeing none, we'll go to the public on RC7 as amended. 2 minutes.
Hi, Greg Alexander. I'm really sorry to waste your time here, but the suggestion that intersections or signalized intersections are good for pedestrians, it's a mixed bag. In this city, for the most part, you have to press a beg button to get a walk sign even on campus. That's asinine. And also, when you go through this traffic study process, you get warrants. They're going to ask the question, should we add a turn lane? Well, they add a turn lane, suddenly you increase your pedestrian crossing distance, perhaps double or even triple it. If you look at any intersections around there where we have added signalized intersections, that's exactly what's happened. They've added turn lanes. In addition, I just cannot emphasize enough that Public Works is doing a really poor job of administrating the signals that we have. You do have to push a button to get a walk signal at so many intersections around town. A lot of intersections around town, the walk signal only shows for 10 seconds, and then there's a minute and a half while cars are going, and not a single direction of pedestrians have. I'm against signalized intersections here, like that's ridiculous, but you really need to supervise the staff and make a signalized intersection worthwhile if you're going to be having private developers pay for signalized intersections. Like that's preposterous. We need to actually get some value out of this if we're going to be having people pay for it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Steve Akers from neighboring Park Ridge. When the traffic study, it's really a traffic count when that's done, that it's important that the traffic count be done at the proper average time of year, not March 15th during spring break, not during winter break, not during breaks. That's from experience in my own neighborhood when that happened to us. So it's important that it be during an average time. It's really about safety. It's making sure that the little count strips are on all four sides of the street, et cetera. So it's a valid, good count, because we do need that data. I think it'll be good just to have that data in anyway. So regardless of where this goes, even if it doesn't happen, we're still going to ask for it, and the city is going to end up putting something in there, I think, just because of the traffic in that area. And also, I want to remind everyone, we talked about this in the Land Use Committee, the Needmore Cafe stops business at least once a day to dial 911 for people injured in that intersection. Now, whether that's in the data or not, that's from the owner of Needmore has told me that. She actually stops her business to go out there to rescue people and call 911. Once a week that happens. So just an example of the amount of craziness, because people they're at odds, they're not sure who goes next, et cetera. So thank you.
Thank you. Any other public comment? See none, back to the council for debate. Any comment on RC7 as amended?
Call the question.
Motion and a second. Will the clerk please call the roll on RC7 as amended?
Councilmember Flaherty?
No.
Smith?
This is the whole thing as amended. And
Councilmember Smith?
he needs clarification on what we're voting on.
We're voting on RC7 as amended, so it's the paying for half a traffic signal.
No, sorry.
Sandberg?
No.
Rallo?
No.
Scambalori?
No.
Rosenbarger?
No.
Sims?
No.
Bolin?
No.
Piedmont Smith?
No.
It fails 0-9. We now go to ordinance 2001 as amended. We are at question period. We are also getting close to 11 o'clock. So are there any questions from council members on ordinance 2001 as amended? Council member?
I am leaving 3 minutes, sorry. So if you have questions for me,
Last chance
I'm
for
happy
questions.
to
Councilmember Piedmont
last
Smith, make it
blush.
good.
Sorry, thank you.
We were given this schematic and some new elevations, and I would like to know what I'm looking at.
I can briefly, they can give you more detail, but this was in my presentation here on the board where they made some changes on the northern elevation, and then they can describe that in more detail, but that is kind of what I was mentioning previously, but I think the architect could give you more detail.
Yeah, so in response to the concern about shadows casting on the north side of the building and just the elevation itself, the owner has agreed to eliminate four one-bedroom units that are 25 feet deep and replace them with a unit that is 20 feet deep. It's a longer, narrower unit, but so we're essentially losing 2 units in the project to do it. But what it effectively will do is on the 4th floor, it'll move. We've now taken, I think, a total of about 50% of that facade on the 4th floor and moved it 20 feet off the property line. So we've gone from 15 feet to 20 feet on 50% of that facade. So and effectively that will reduce the effect of the shadow on the north property.
And is that just on the 4th floor or on all floors?
I'm sorry.
Is the reduction of the 5 feet, is that on all floors or just on the 4th floor?
Just the 4th floor, with the idea that it's the 4th floor that's really that's the top, the rooftop is what's casting the shadow. So I think it'll have the effect that we want.
Thank you.
Last chance to ask the question of staff before she goes. Any questions for staff on ordinance 2001 as amended? Seeing none, Ms. Scanlon, we thank you for your attendance tonight. We appreciate your time. And we are going now to members of the public to comment on the project as amended. We have 10 minutes for it and 2 minutes per person.
Before Ms. Scallon leaves, I just noticed in the rendering in one of the slides up there, when we were talking about the amphitheater, I noticed that there is where is it? Yeah, if you could pull it up. We talked a lot about the amphitheater, but right below it says concrete stage / performance plaza. I'm sorry to open a can of worms, but what's that? Is it even more than the amphitheater? It says concrete stage performance plaza. It's the same issue as the amphitheater, and I'm sorry that I didn't notice it before. So if maybe Tyler can.
Sorry, this is public comment. We can take it up
Sorry,
if you like.
okay, that's it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Any other public comment on ordinance 2001 as amended? If there's no public comment, we'll come back to council for one last chance at questions. Councilmember Piedmont Smith.
So this is a question for the petitioner. The stage that Mr. Akers was referring to is actually part of the amphitheater, right? So it's not a separate thing.
Order, please.
For the record, Steve Brehab. It's a concrete patio. It's the sidewalk that goes into the building. When the whole thought was this was an amphitheater, then somebody would stand out on the concrete patio and it would function as a stage.
Thank you.
It's still a patio.
Any final questions for the petitioner on ordinance 2001 as amended? Seeing none, we come back to the council for debate. We have maximum 30 minutes, 3 minutes per person. Does anyone like to speak? Councilmember Sandberg.
I want to thank the petitioners. Again, this has been a long process of honing this and getting it to fit in a very small parcel and to do so as appropriately as possible. So that's all I want to say. I'm in full support. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Sandberg. Any other comment? Councilmember Piedmont Smith.
Yes, I would like to thank, as the chair of the Land Use Committee, I would like to thank the committee members. I think we worked very well together. We divvied up the ideas for the reasonable conditions, and we worked on them in the last few days and talking with staff and with the petitioner. So I wanted to express my appreciation for that. It's unfortunate that Councilmember Rollo seems to have departed for the night because I wanted to point out that we did work very hard on these RCs. The fact that there were a couple of question marks hanging, I think, is not a reflection of any kind of lackadaisical attitude on the part of committee members. And I also want to point out that reasonable conditions do not have to come from the Land Use Committee. They can come from any council members, and yet there was no effort on the part of any other council members, except for Councilmember Smith, who did suggest some as the district rep. But there were no suggestions from Councilmember Rollo or others as to reasonable conditions. And once again, they were, the ideas of the reasonable conditions were in the packet that was distributed last Friday. So with that, I am planning to vote in favor of this. I think that I want to also recognize the time that many of the neighbors put into speaking about this and contacting us with their concerns. I think it's difficult at any time to balance neighbor concerns with the need for increased density in the city and our desire to build where there already are amenities and connections and utilities and such, rather than sprawling out into the county. So I know that's a difficult balance to strike, and it's difficult for people who are used to looking at a green field for 20 years to suddenly have something built there. But I think this is an appropriate place for development and for this type of development to go. So thank you also to the developer for your patience, and I think that we've come up with an improved project.
Thank you. Any other final comment? I'll take my opportunity, just very briefly. I want to thank the petitioner for all the effort that they put into it. I want to thank the Land Use Committee for all the effort they put into it. I want to thank staff for all the effort they've put in. I think this has been a better process. We are getting out at 11 instead of 1. We went 5 minutes over. But I think that, I think that, there was some absurdity in tonight, but I think that really what this discussion was about was who gets to decide. And I'm going to stand up for council's authority to have input into this process, and that includes making changes at the end. We did not eliminate that when we created the Land Use Committee. With that, we have a motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
We have a motion and a second on Ordinance 2001 as amended. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Councilmember Smith?
Yes, go District 3.
Councilmember Sandberg?
Yes.
Councilmember Scambaluri?
Yes.
Councilmember Rosenbarger?
Yes.
Councilmember Sims?
Yes.
Councilmember Volin?
Yes.
Councilmember Piedmont Smith?
Yes.
And Councilmember Flaherty?
Yes.
It passes 8-0. Congratulations. Good luck. We now go to legislation for first reading.
Or be introduced and read by title and synopsis only.
Motion is second. All in favor, say
Aye.
Will the clerk please read?
Ordinance 2004 to amend the City of Bloomington zoning maps by rezoning property from business park and residential single family to join an existing planned unit development and to approve the associated district ordinance and preliminary plan regarding 1550 North Arlington Park Drive. Trinitas petitioner. The synopsis is as follows. Ordinance 2004 would rezone property from business park and residential single family to become part of an existing planned unit development with a total of 40.75 acres and approve the associated district ordinance and preliminary plan.
Thank you. We now go to additional public comment. Is there anybody who'd like to speak on an item that's not on the agenda? Yes, Mr. Sherman.
I think you just introduced an item that needs to be referred to committee.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes. I move that ordinance 2004 be referred to the Land Use Committee.
Motion and a second. Is it a roll call vote or voice vote?
Yes, I did want to inquire whether you wanted to work out the timing of the 2 meetings next week. This might be a good time to.
I would ask that the motion be amended to make the Land Use Committee meet at 5:45. 5:45 with a 2-hour limit, and that the Committee of the Whole would meet at 8.
Yes, I accept your amendment to
Thank
my
you.
motion. Call the question.
Second.
Will the clerk please call the roll on the motion?
What?
The motion is to refer to Land Use Committee, to Land Use Committee at 5:45 on February 12th, with the Committee of the Whole to follow at 8 p.m.
I'm sorry, I actually have a comment, if
Yes,
it's not too
please.
late. We don't have to change this now. My general preference would be to start Land Use Committee at 5:30, since we aren't able to do so, and end at 7:30 and go right into the next committee meetings in the future, rather than booking this extra time, just in order to keep things running more tightly and prevent late meetings. That's just my preference. So I'm happy to support this amendment and this schedule now. I just wanted to express that at this time.
We can and should talk about it at some future meeting, but for now, I think we should just, this is the same schedule we've had earlier this year with the same conditions. Any other comment?
But
Absolutely.
Just because we've done it, don't mean that's the way we're going to
It's just
always do
expediency
it.
right now, just trying to get
Okay.
through the night.
Oh,
Any
really?
other?
Oh, really?
Any other? Will the clerk please read? Or please call the roll. Sorry. On the motion to refer.
Yeah. Councilmember Sandberg,
Yes.
Scambluri,
Yes.
Rosenbarger,
Yes.
Sims,
Yes.
Volin,
Yes.
Piedmont Smith,
Yes.
Flaherty,
Yes.
Smith.
Yes.
It's 8-0. We now go to additional public comment. Is there anyone to speak on an item not on the agenda? Seeing none, we go to council schedule. Mr. Sherman.
Yes, some action needed, just some reminders. First of all, we have a council work session scheduled for Friday. This would cover items that usually come up in the second legislative cycle of February. At this point, all you're looking at is a resolution to approve the community block grant funding, and we usually do that at one meeting, and that's what I've heard from council leadership. So given that, this would be your only chance this Friday for those of you who aren't familiar with this proposal to hear about it before it's up for final action. So do you want to hold or cancel that meeting this Friday?
Who wants to attend the work session on Friday to hear about the CDBG funding? Raise your hand, please. We're seeing no takers, so let's cancel.
That makes sense, since many of the newly elected officials do have some close knowledge of this resolution, so I'm not surprised by your decision. Reminder, you have a joint work session with the county executive and fiscal bodies this coming Monday at 5 o'clock at the Nat U. Hill Room, just a reminder. You may want to take action on a special council work session for Valentine's Day on our favorite topic, standing committees. That would be at noon. The room is, I think, to be decided. But if you're ready to make that decision, we could post notice and get it out tomorrow.
I would suggest that you post notice so that anyone who wants to attend from the council can attend without worrying about notice being posted. Please post notice, make it a public meeting of council.
So is there a vote to hold a special council work session on February the 14th?
All right.
Okay.
There's a motion and a second. How about we do voice vote? All in favor of a work session on the 14th, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, say nay.
All right, the next is just to give you a sense of what's happening in the second legislative cycle. So on the 19th, we'll have the CDBG resolution, and we'll have another chance to talk about, to act on standing committees. On the next week, that's the 26th, I have that the wrong date there. It'll be your second hearing on Trinitros, because you'll hear that next week, by the way. You're just, yeah. And also that night, you may be hearing more about towing, just to let you know what's happening. On March 4th, the only item up is Trinitas PUD. And do know that night is a two-meeting night because the following week is spring break. So March 4th, regular session, Committee of the Whole, Trinitas at the...
That's enough advance notice, I think, for us for tonight.
Okay. Lastly, do recall we have a State of the City special session on Thursday, February 20th, 7 p.m., Buskirk, Chumley. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Any motion to adjourn? All in favor of adjournment, say aye. Aye. We are adjourned.